so much for coming to our Best Practices for ELA Differentiation webinar. We appreciate you being here this afternoon. First and foremost, we'd like to thank the Department of Education. They're the ones who sponsor these webinars, so we appreciate them being able to bring these webinars for free. You are all muted, so you don't have to worry, we can't hear you. We want you to ask questions throughout this webinar, so please put those in the Q&A section of your Zoom screen. It's hard for us to do any sort of raising of hands, so putting your questions right in there will be helpful, and we will feed questions to each other throughout the presentation. You can also, if you feel like it's something you want to just ask at the end, you can go ahead and send it to us at the end, because we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Tomorrow, 24 hours from when this webinar ends, you will receive an email. It will have a link to the PD certificate, and it will tell you where to find the video of this webinar. It will also have the PowerPoint or Google Slides from this webinar that will have all the really great links attached to it. Also, as you log off this webinar, there will be a brief survey. We actually did a few small changes from our math differentiation webinar to this one. So we really do appreciate your feedback. So if you could just take the time, that would be great. On the webinar this afternoon, I'm Heather Jenkins. I will be one of the folks that is doing the presentation this afternoon. I also have my colleague here, Marissa Hooper. She will also be doing a portion of this webinar.
Hi, everyone.
And then Kristen Crawford is not here this afternoon, but she is our Department of Education rep that is part of this data coaching contract as well. So she also will have her information at the end of this if you want to get in touch with any of us. Our essential understandings today, really what we want to get to the crux of is to gain a better understanding of how to use data to help us meet the needs of all of our students while making it manageable. A lot of times differentiation has the sort of reputation of being extremely difficult and hard to manage. We're going to try to help you out with that today. And we also want to help you enhance your understanding of the components of effective literacy instruction to meet the diverse needs of your students. And we really want to talk a lot about today Tier 1 instruction. So we're not just talking Tier 2 and Tier 3 for differentiation. An overview of what we're going to be looking at today is there's an overview of what we are really thinking of for differentiation. There's also a section about using data to differentiate and different ways that you can do that, and then a transferring to the classroom. Last week, we had the math differentiation. If you were in that particular webinar, this webinar is going to be very similar for the first couple of sections. And then the transferring to the classroom is going to give you some ideas about specifically ELA. But when it comes to differentiation, it's universal, whether it's math, ELA, science, social studies, whatever it is. So we'll get to it. For differentiation, here is our word cloud. I'm going to turn my video off so that you can see the whole screen. There are a lot of words and sort of buzzwords going around that have to do with differentiation. These are all of the ones that we put in here. But there's a lot of nuances with each one of these, and we pulled together what we feel are best practices for differentiation, and that's what we're going to be showing you today. So going over some of these ways of thinking about differentiation is there's differentiated instruction, right? Tailoring instruction to meet the needs of your diverse students, abilities, styles, learning styles, and interests. There's personalized learning that people are doing that is customizing learning experiences for your students. There's UDL, which is really that educational framework that allows our learning to be accessible by all students. There's responsive teaching, which is you're taking a look at your students in front of you right now and you're responding to that. And then there's equitable instruction and making sure that all of the students within your classroom have equal access to the education. So when it comes to what we're learning about today, we're going to talk about all of these, but the three that I have highlighted on our screen right now is where our focus will be. That being said, this is not a UDL webinar, but we are using a lot of information that you could apply to that framework in what we're talking about today. So when it comes to differentiation, we really value the fact of looking at the students that are directly in front of you each and every day. But that does not mean that you don't take into consideration students that you've had in the past or what you know are different learning styles in front of you, and what potentially may help students learn that are either in front of you right now or potentially might have a little bit different learning style. We also look at making sure that whatever we are doing in Tier 1 provides all students with opportunities to reach those high standards and their full potential. The big thing to take away from this is that we want to make sure that we are keeping our standards high for what we are asking students to do in our particular grade level. The way that education has been going, we know that the direction, there's a lot more students that are coming in lower. We're needing to bridge gaps that are getting further and further away from our grade levels that we are currently teaching. But that does not mean that we are going to take the standards for our grade level and lower them because of where students are coming in. We want to make sure that we're keeping them high and bring students along as far as we can each year. So differentiation has a little bit of a, I guess, bad reputation in some respects. One of them is that misconception that if we're going to differentiate, it means creating a lot of different resources, grouping kids all the time, having different students doing different things all the time. So every lesson means that you have 6 different paths of which students are going to be able to gain understanding of that particular concept. So that's one big misunderstanding. And then the other misunderstanding is having this be a part of your Tier 1 instruction. A lot of times you have instruction and then it feels like the differentiation piece is always when students are doing their independent work. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how your Tier 1 instruction can include differentiation in a way that is, again, not just generating all sorts of different resources and creating a lot of extra work. What differentiation does require is making sure that you are really understanding the requirements of the students in your class. We've had webinars already this year about standards and depth of knowledge, understanding a little bit of what your learning outcomes should be, and you really need to understand what the learning outcomes are. The other thing that it requires is responding to your students' needs throughout your lesson and when you're planning your lessons. So you're already planning for the differences of what students might need to be able to access the information. And you're really constructing those lessons based on the needs of your students. So a little bit of what is not differentiated. So just standing at the board and just talking at students and asking them to complete something. So task completion is not necessarily differentiated. If we're really just focusing on them completing tasks, we need to rethink what we're doing. It is not repeating your grade level skills over and over and over until they test. It is not moving on to the next topic just to be able to get, like once it's assessed, moving on just to be able to cover every topic that you feel like you need to cover in your grade level. differentiation isn't that once in a blue moon event in a classroom. So it's not okay, I have centers on this day and that's how I'm going to differentiate. And it is not necessarily an individualized instruction for every single student in your classroom. What it is getting to know your students, getting to understand where they are, making observations, and having conversation in your classroom. It's creating a culture that we are expecting that all students can learn, and sometimes they will take different paths with that. It is teaching in response to understanding your students, their goals, and your curriculum, and it is consistently reviewing proof of student progress and making informed decisions on what needs to be done going forward. So things you will need is to know your students well, to know your content or your curriculum well. You need to be creative and flexible in your thinking. And you need to have the belief that all students can learn, right? We've all had those students that it seems like they're just not there, they're not putting in the effort, but we need to truly believe that all students can learn. We want to make sure that we have a clear sense of what they should know and what they should be able to do at your grade level. You want to make sure also that your classroom culture models people and students being able to have different choices, respecting their differences, and having that safety of being able to collaborate. And the thing that we're really trying to do with differentiation is building what we call that toolkit. I wish I had another word for it, but toolkit is really the best sort of analogy that I can think of. You have all of these different ways that you know that you can help students gain access to the curriculum. And really, it's not just building that toolkit for specific students, it's taking that toolkit and making it accessible to all students. And then making sure that you're thinking about those tasks and ongoing assessment. Really, we're highlighting here that we have a clear sense of what students should know and be able to do. So these are some of the things that are foundational skills for literacy. This is a third grade example, but we have what information do we want them to know? Then what are the bigger concepts that we want them to understand? And what skill applications or what do we want students to be able to do? So this is just one example for third grade, and it has to do with fluency. So the example that we have here, you can see, goes from we want that students to be able to read accurately and smoothly with various amounts of text. We want them to go, when it comes to the understanding, we want them to go beyond just reading the words correctly. We want them to understand what the author is saying or the type of text and, understand who is speaking and how they're speaking. And then what we want them to be able to do is to be able to read a lot of different types of content at an appropriate rate and with expression. So you can kind of see how that particular skill builds on itself. When we're talking about responding to student understanding or differentiating, or again, being flexible with the methods and materials, that's a big thing. It's not just always using the same method or the same materials to teach skills. We want to model or offer a variety of examples. We want to build and really elicit that background knowledge for students. We want to make sure that we're providing think time for students when we're asking them questions or asking them to reflect on something. And we want to make sure that we're explaining a concept in more than one way. So just differentiation is not effective without that quality universal instruction, right? Our tier 1 instruction is where the crux and the bulk of what all students are learning is going to be. So we want to make sure that we're really effective in that tier 1 universal instruction. The other thing is we have a lot of times we're thinking, okay, we have to differentiate. So it's like creating the centers on one day. That's the day that I'm really able to effectively differentiate. We want you to be intentional in your planning. It shouldn't just be one day a week that we're thinking about differentiation. It is all day, every day. And we're going to make it a little bit more manageable with some of these ways that we're going to talk about helping you with that. You want to know your purpose of differentiation, and we want to plan for the desired student outcomes and adjust based on student data and outcomes. So as we're talking about data, this is where we're getting into the next section, is using data to differentiate.
So we wanted to just remember the essentials when we talk about using data to differentiate, because remembering these is going to help us with this collection of data. So really knowing our students, what their abilities, what they like to do, maybe their learning styles, any accommodations they may have on IEPs and 504s, and then even some needs that students have beyond differentiation, and also students who are not on IEPs or 504s, but might require something similar. Really knowing your content, so your grade level standards, really understanding those, that's going to allow you to respond to your students and their needs. And stating those learning objectives and success criteria and really putting it in student language that they can understand. And then knowing your content is not teaching to the middle anymore because it's not working. We really want to teach to both ends of the spectrum as well and include them. So creating lessons and planning your instruction that allows each end of the spectrum to be able to, have that differentiated instruction. And then we want to continue the use of ongoing assessments. That can seem a little overwhelming, but really when we're collecting data, we are collecting data through these assessments. And those are both formal and informal. We're going to be talking about the more informal types of assessments that you can be using. And then making sure that we're collecting the right data to differentiate accordingly. So what data does is it really drives our responsive teaching. So as we're collecting this data, it's going to allow us to respond to the students in front of us. As we stated earlier, that is really what differentiation is and what we're talking about. And it's through that responsive teaching that we are able to meet the needs of the students in our classroom. So we've been talking about data collecting, and what we really want to do is expand our definition of data. Sometimes we think that that's just the data collection is how students perform on an assessment, and that's not just the case. So anything that we know about our students, about who they are, how they learn, and how they interact with the world, that is data that we can collect and use. So it can take the form of remembering a hallway conversation that you have with a student, evaluating a writing sample, or transcribing student talk during a book club. So more anecdotal data. So when we talk about this data collection, we're really talking about, in our tier 1 instruction, the students in front of us, how we're going to use that. So we are assessing the students informally in front of us constantly. So we made this graphic just to show that in our tier 1 instruction, we should constantly be doing this. And again, I know that can sound overwhelming, but once we go more into details about what exactly those assessments are, then it will make a little more sense. So we're going to assess our students, constantly collecting that data, and then responding and differentiating based on the results from that collection. And we are consistently doing that and then meeting the needs of our students in front of us. So there are two types that we talked about. We talked about formal data, which could be the New Hampshire SAS, progress monitoring, universal assessments, an end of unit assessment. That can really drive kind of our interventions and how we approach that with students after the fact. We today are going to be talking about the informal data, which is really going to help us differentiate our tier 1 instruction. So this informal data collection that we're talking about can be exit tickets, conferences that you have with students, observing. We can collect a lot of data through our observations and respond immediately based on what we're seeing. Any discussions that you have with students, and also the discussions that students are having with each other. And then their body language. We can learn a lot through kind of how they're responding to us based on motivation. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you can collect this data and respond to it in your ELA classroom. So the first one we talked about was exit tickets and conferences that you're having with students. So, and we're talking about how to collect this data because we don't want it to seem too overwhelming. So we're really gathering exit ticket evidence on a practice skill. So once you collect that, you can see how students are really doing with that skill. Also maintaining anecdotal records of student goals and progress. So what goals students have and how they're doing towards meeting that goal. And then reviewing their reflections through writing and drawing can help us determine where students are at and also what they need. So how can we, if we collected this data, how can we respond to it and differentiate to our students in front of us? So we can strategically form small groups in order to meet their needs, scaffold text and writing tasks, and really break that down. That will come later. Also, we'll give more specific examples of how to do that. And then to provide a wide range of texts, media, audio, and visuals, really allowing kids to, it's part of the differentiation overview of teaching something in more than one way. So we want to really provide a wide range. And then engaging students in goal setting and self-monitoring. This success criteria we talked about earlier, really knowing your standards. Not only is it important for you to know, but also your students to really know what they need to do to be successful so that they can create their own goals and they can self-monitor kind of where they're at as well. So observations and discussions, this is a type of data collection that you will probably use the most. So really when we're collecting this data, we're talking about observing students when they're reading, writing, they're speaking, and they're listening, and kind of what behaviors they have while doing so. And you can also listen to recording of students reading aloud, reading their writing, and then how they are responding to the reading that they're doing. And then listening to student talk during interactive read aloud, any partner work, book clubs, however you're kind of setting up your classroom, how they're talking to each other about the work that they're doing. So when we collect this, we can meet their needs by actually doing the modeling of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. We can provide thinking stems or conversation frames. So really making sure that we are asking questions that are meaningful and allow students to have an access point to what they're doing. And establishing structures and routines in your classroom for partner and group ELA work. Having structures there for students are really important, especially for them to know what they need to be able to do. And lastly, body language. We really wanted to hit on this because this is one that that we might not always think of, that we're collecting data of the students in front of us and how they're behaving. So observing their body language, their engagement with class, with whatever you're doing, and their self-regulation during reading and writing. We can constantly be thinking about how they're engaging. And we want to note student preferences and behaviors. So like we said, really knowing our students so you can know what behaviors are, kind of out of character for a student. And when that happens, we want to respond by adapting our lessons accordingly to the level of motivation or engagement. So if kids are slumped over or they're kind of walking in and already, in this kind of state of mind, we want to respond on the spot and how we can adapt our lessons to help our students be more engaged. And maybe using timers and sticky notes to manage time and chunk our tasks can help students kind of get out of that, whatever mood they're in, to help be more engaged in the class. And we just want to note to make sure that we're curious about maybe why they're not engaged. Sometimes it's easy to make assumptions about a student about why they're disengaged. And a lot of times it's because they're maybe confused about what's going on and they're not able to participate because their needs aren't being met for some reason. So really be curious about why they're not engaged and then respond accordingly to help them.
Okay, so the next section is, okay, now we have all of this knowledge. How are we going to transfer this to the classroom? So the first things first, just this quote, I think is helpful for us to make sure that we are looking at and viewing all of the students and abilities in our classroom through an asset-based lens, right? So when we talk about asset-based, it's really celebrating the thinking that students are having and what they're able to produce in the classroom, rather than saying, okay, you don't have this part. So we're really celebrating the successes in the classroom and showing students what we feel they're doing well in the classroom. So we talk about, when we're talking about differentiation this afternoon, we're talking about tier 1, right? So we're starting with tier 1. So tier 1 really centers on 3 interwoven elements. So first is that high quality instructional material, right? We want to continue to stay up to date and to be current with what we are doing with our teaching practices. We know that if we've been teaching for a number of years, what we used 10 years ago is not necessarily resonating with students at this current time frame. So we want to make sure that we continue to stay up to date with those materials. We want to make sure we're also staying up to date with our instructional supports and our interventions, right? Differentiation is really, like we have students that we know need some sort of intervention. A lot of our schools have a win time or an intervention time. And that's where we're able to really look at what students need at that time and respond to what that is. But within our classrooms, we also want to make sure that we are thinking about, again, like Marissa was saying, we're not just teaching to the middle, but we're teaching to all levels of students on each end of the spectrum. And that way we're meeting the needs of everybody. And we want to make sure that we have those formative assessments. How are they doing on a daily basis to be able to understand where their strengths and weaknesses are so that we can then respond to that? So just pushing through our curriculum without thinking of those things would not be really responding and being able to differentiate. So we're talking about planning for all. So all means students who are requiring English, they're identified as struggling or having a disability, or those who need enrichment. So for everybody. So these supports that we're thinking about would be explicit strategy instruction. So we want to explicitly teach them different strategies. We want to make sure that we are modeling all the time. We are thinking aloud and modeling that particular behavior. When we're talking about teaching and assessing, we want to make sure that we structure the environment according to what we know all students needs, right? So we want to make sure that our environment is able to take into consideration what our students are. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have balls for everybody to sit on in your teaching environment and that you have all these different areas within your classroom, but you want to think about how students, what resonates with them, and making sure your environment is having students be able to access that. We want to identify and remove potential barriers, not just as we're teaching, but before we're teaching as well, right? As we go through and we teach from year to year to year, we have students that had barriers in our classroom and we helped them with those barriers. So what we can do now is assume that there are students who have these barriers and allow them to use or have the environment be barrier-free. So as we start to learn what those barriers are and what we can do to respond to those, we then have that be part of our daily practice year in and year out. We want to make sure to provide clarity for students, not just on what you're expecting them to learn and what their outcomes are, but in general, we want to make sure that they have clarity on the concepts that they are learning each day. It is also helpful to consider alternate assessments, right? Sometimes we have just one way that we're assessing specific skills. We want to think about what are some ways that we might be able to open that up and to have an alternative way for assessing those skills. And we want to emphasize practice and summary. So what we want students to be able to understand and for us to be able to really make sure that they're getting that practice in. Some of this has to do with chunking or scaffolding what students are learning in the classroom. So we want to make sure if we're chunking it and it's this really big concept, right? We want to chunk it and say, all right, let's figure out how we can break this into manageable pieces so that students can understand the material in a little bit shorter spurts to be able to make that really manageable for all students. For scaffolding, we want to make sure that we're aligning to our standards and concepts and skills. So if we're scaffolding, maybe we need to look at what those prerequisite skills are and align those so that mini lessons or some sort of pre-teaching could be done for the whole group if necessary, and so that they can make sure that they have those, basic understandings to be able to get to where they are now and make those connections in their learning. So as we break down differentiation, some of the things that I want you to think about is what we can do as teachers and what the students would also be able to do. So as elementary teachers, we tend to do a pretty good job of moving around the classroom during student work time or even during teaching time, right? But that's something you want to make sure that you're doing all of the time. You're moving around, you're seeing what students are doing. You're able to be in different parts of the classroom. You're also, when you're doing that, you're able to gather and utilize information that you might be finding as you're circling around the classroom. What are students doing with the information? Are they getting a specific concept? Are they working independently? Are you able to offer feedback to students as you are going around the classroom if they're doing independent work? Are we making sure to scaffold our instruction and looking at the questions that we are asking? So are we making sure that we are teaching to all different depths of knowledge, right? There was the webinar that we did on standards and depth of knowledge. And one of the things that really is a takeaway of that is that specifically for ELA, there are different types of questions that might be a lower depth of knowledge, like a depth of knowledge 1 or 2, like the who, what, when, where, why, right? And so as we're thinking about that, are we making sure that we're moving on with questions that are asking them to explain different things that they are understanding, and making sure that we are giving them the opportunity to really strengthen their understanding and get to a deeper depth of knowledge when they're ready. And then as teachers, we want to make sure that we're obviously looking and actively seeking evidence of student understanding, right? We want to, on a daily basis, be assessing whether students are getting it, whether they aren't, and having that teaching directly respond to where we know our students are at. This does not mean completely taking what you are trying to teach in your scope and sequence and coming to a complete halt because students are not understanding it and spending so much additional time on a concept that you're not necessarily getting to the content that you need to within your scope and sequence. But what it does mean is making sure that if we have different ways that we have been able to teach it in the past and it's resonated with students, then make sure that we are continuously using that the next time around with students and giving them all different sort of starting points for where students can enter into that understanding and that learning. What we want students to be able to do is we want them to be able to take ownership of their learning. We want them to have personalized goals and to understand what they're doing next. That does not mean that every single student in your classroom will have a completely different goal. But what it means is that students understand where they are and where they're going with a specific type of content or a specific unit of instruction. We want students to be able to ask for help and not feel like they're inadequate when they need to ask for help. We want them to rely on you. We want them to rely on others. And we want them to utilize their resources that are given to them. So whatever it is that you're giving for resources, whether it be maybe a graphic organizer, or maybe it's something where you have words up in the classroom, but maybe each child also has a list of words at their desk, or whether it be that they're able to use a specific type of media to be able to access their understanding. You want all the students to be able to have access to that and to be able to utilize those resources. The big thing and the big push in education right now is for collaboration to be happening with their peers as well. We are standing up, we are doing our model lessons, we are modeling for them, but we also need to give them opportunities for them to learn from each other. So we want to make sure that they're collaborating with their peers and that they are able to discuss their understanding with others in their classroom that isn't just their classroom teacher. And we want to make sure that students are able to follow those modeled structures and routines. So we set the stage for all of those particular structures so that students it's crystal clear to them what they should be doing during different portions of a lesson or different activities. So when we're talking about whole class structures and routines, when it comes to reading, we want students to obviously read aloud often, for us even to be reading aloud often, not just your students. It's not just going around the room and having them read aloud to you, but we want to read aloud from a variety of texts from different digital platforms, and make sure that we're providing that variety when we are doing our instruction. We want to be doing think alouds and model that sort of metacognition or thinking during those particular lesson, and make sure that we're modeling those behaviors of strong readers. What are we thinking about, right? How are we thinking during our reading? So we are really modeling that for our students. We're also supporting the knowledge and sort of that expansion of understanding and vocabulary by curating text sets around a specific topic. We're thinking about student interests and we're having them access a range of text types and complexities. We're also planning for those interactive read alouds. It's very similar to a think aloud, right? So making sure, again, that we have the ability to model those comprehension strategies to teach specific vocabulary or a specific structure for students to understand. We want to keep our teaching points really clear. It's crystal clear what we want students to be understanding. So that means it tends to be a relatively short amount of time. One of the things that we're doing as teachers when we feel like kids aren't understanding is we're talking more. And sometimes talking more isn't necessarily equating to learning more for those students. So we want to make sure that we're making it very clear that we want students to be able to also practice with partners and model with partners, and that they're getting feedback either from you or their partners as well. And then to create class fluency routines through echo reading or choral reading can also be something that can be really effective. When it comes to writing, and we're talking about whole class structures and routines, some of the things that we can think about with writing is using example texts or mentor texts to help people and help your students understand different genres, different forms, and different structures of writing. We want to model and provide graphic organizers and make them available to all students. We want them to be able to do their planning, and we want them to have choice in what they're doing for their planning, whether it be for a sentence, a paragraph, or full text. We want to make sure that those organizers are a scaffold for students, and they're meant to sort of fade over time, right? So sometimes we have those graphic organizers that are really spell out exactly what students need to have within their writing. And then over time, maybe it gets to be they're able to have choice or to create the graphic organizers even on their own. We want to include time for choice writing to see where student skills really are and if they're able to transfer what they're doing within a specific program that you have, and really be able to transfer those skills outside of the program and have them show what they know outside of maybe that, one particular text and responding to one particular text. We want them to be able to have choice in that, and it helps us understand what types of instruction they may need as well. We want to explicitly teach the stages of the writing process, right? So we all know in elementary school, when a student completes a piece of writing, they think they are done, right? It's done. Why would I edit? We want to explicitly teach why we edit. We want them to establish their own processes for writing and know when maybe a peer edit might be happening, or maybe there's a specific draft that they're doing, and we want to teach that early on. Again, we want to keep our teaching points clear, just like we did for reading. We want them to practice with partners and model that feedback. So it's not just for reading, but also for writing. And then we want to build that community where writers share with each other, right? They can read it aloud, or, it doesn't have to be their whole piece of writing. I know how painful it can be in the younger grades to have students do their full piece of writing. So maybe it's a single favorite line that they have from a particular piece of writing, or you could have a writer's cafe for that. And then you want to allow students, it seems simple, but different types of paper as they experiment with how they want to format or structure things. And then there's a little link here that can bring you to the different examples of what you might be able to use. When it comes to really differentiating whole class structures and routines, these are just some specific resources that we have to be able to help you with some of these and some of the tools that you might be able to use. So there's the Read Aloud project through Achieve the Core. There's the 6 shifts, so you can download it here. This just happens to be grades 3 through 5. And then creating text sets in your classroom. Here's a getting started guide for creating different text sets within your classroom. Other things, those were more reading. This is more of a the writing tools that you might have. So this is a general sort of writing process tool that we have here so that students can really start understanding the process of writing. This is just some general resources on how to structure your writing and what you might be able to use for different papers. And then these are just different graphic organizers that you might be able to use and different templates that you might be able to use that are free. So we talked about whole group. So now just looking at differentiating for maybe some small group instruction for reading and writing. Again, we want to make sure if we are doing any sort of small group instruction that they would be very flexible. We need to look at specific data, and it's not necessarily leveled, right? They might be working on the same specific skills, but this is not, we're not talking about leveled groups here. We want to make sure that we have specific goals in mind for those particular small group instruction. Maybe this is during a win time, maybe this is during, you know, a specific time frame within your classroom. But again, we want to make sure that that tier 1 instruction for everybody is where we're really thinking about the making sure we're meeting the needs of students and then taking small groups as necessary. You can establish student-led groups. You could do book clubs, you could do fluency practice, revising or editing, you could do feedback loops, etc. You want to really also consider the needs of students across all areas of reading. So whether it's vocabulary or comprehension, phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency. You could be working with small groups on this if you think students might need a little bit of extra practice with that. Reciprocal teaching is also a really effective way for students to take on different roles, and over time they can have student-led groups for that. And then make sure you're thinking about motivation and engagement as well. When we talk about UDL and the Universal Design for Learning, we want to make sure that we're looking at engagement, and we want to take those scientific practices we know about student motivation and engagement and incorporate that into any sort of, whether it be whole group or small group, to make sure that we're keeping those things in mind to be able to create that particular instruction. So these are some just general resources that we have on reciprocal teaching. This is a video that talks about reciprocal teaching. So if you're not really well versed in reciprocal teaching, this can help you understand what that might look like within your classroom. And then these are some tools for some small group instruction. So you can take a look at these. Basically, these are hierarchy of action for determining where you might start with reading or where you might start with your writing goals. And then this is just a companion resource with that so that you can just make sure that you're keeping it all in one place. When we're talking about differentiating or looking at your teaching in a little bit different way with independent practice time, you could reframe your independent reading time to create really what the students need for different choice within their reading. right? And what that might be. So the reading diet, right, is just looking at making sure that we're looking at all levels of text and making sure that students are gaining an understanding and have the ability to look at different levels of text and different types of text. You could establish a classroom routine or chart of what independent practice time looks like, sounds like, feels like, and making sure that you understand that that independent practice time is just a portion of what you're doing for your literacy time. You can include reading and writing engagement inventories, so your observations of students, self-reflection tools, all of those things can help you drive your instruction. You can model routines for recording the reading of texts or student writing. You can understand what fluency reading is or partner reading is. We just really need to model those routines. And we want to ensure that students have the opportunity at some point to make some choice in what they're reading, how they're reading, or where they're reading throughout the week. It can be really helpful for that independent practice time to give that choice. And then we want to make sure that we have that individual goal setting and monitoring of skills, and that independent practice time is when you can really implement that. And then when you plan, you want to be able to confer and make sure that you're conferring with students on a regular basis so that you can check on goals, observe what their transfer skills are, and you can build those relationships with your students. Here are some class structures that you might be able to use for independent practice time. So this is just some general information on whether students are engaged and how they are doing with their goals. So these could be helpful for you. When we're talking about differentiation, we also want to make sure that we're keeping your student characteristics in mind. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about interest, we're thinking about readiness, how ready students are for understanding specific skills. And we want to make sure that we're looking at their learning profile, what their talents are, what their prior knowledge is, what their success criteria has been in the past. So here are some different ways to differentiate for student characteristics. So what is the same for students, right? What is that same concept that's being taught to each student, right? We're teaching one thing to every student, and then we're thinking of different strategies or ways that we might be able to make sure that students access that. So what might be happening is we might be looking at what the manner is that students are getting this particular understanding. We might want to vary our topics or our skills depending on where students are. The Iris Center has a lot of information about the different ways that different strategies you might be able to use to differentiate. So the strategies that they have here, like tiered activities or learning centers, having interactive journals or graphic organizers or jigsaw activities. If you click on this, it will bring you right to the page and you can start to look at these and what that might mean for your specific grade level. In addition, the Iris Center has a whole information page on the Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, and the things that you can keep in mind as you're planning. Again, that the UDL and the work with the New Hampshire Department of Education and CAST is really, it's a framework to be able to make sure that we're incorporating all the things we know about our students, about what their motivation and what their specific science is behind being able to have a certain amount of interest and understanding. So those can be really helpful as well. So to increase interest within your classrooms, You want to intentionally build and elicit background knowledge. Again, that wide selection of texts that reflect your grade level content. We want a range of complexity, and we want a range of interest to be able to have students really be hooked in. We want to provide broad access for reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and all of those supports through also using technology. We want to model the students being able to have choice and invite students to make choices to build agency, right? That student agency is what we're working a lot on right now. How do we get them motivated, and how do we get them understand where their sort of work in this is going to really create that different level of understanding. And then we want to incorporate students' interests in pop culture. It's really interesting in talking about this. We know when it comes to reading and writing, we can see over the years that students' interests and what they're writing about has changed. So it would be good to be able to incorporate a little bit of that into our teaching practice as well. And we want to give students an authentic audience for their speaking and writing. So we want to make it understandable. We want to make it really relevant to them, right? So if they are writing, we want to give them an audience that truly understands what they're writing about. We want them to think about that. We want them to really have those authentic situations and those authentic experiences. And we want to highlight those connections, right? We have content and we have our students. Where are those connections that they're making between what they're learning and who they are as people? And we want to honor the cultural knowledge that students have, the wide range of understanding that students have, and what they bring into school. So we want to make sure that we celebrate that and know that. When it comes to student readiness, we want to use TOP to build confidence in writers, right? So we want to be able to talk about our writing and work through our writing, either in small group, whole group, or what have you. We want to make sure that we're using a variety of texts when it comes to small group, independent practice, or any sort of time-based practice, and make sure that we're meeting the needs of our students. We're going to remove or add scaffolds as needed. We want to be careful not to over scaffold. Again, those scaffolds that we're doing are meant to fade away over time. And we want to adjust the content based on what we know our students' background knowledge is, and we want to vary that content in our presentation modes. We don't want to just present every day with a PowerPoint, or every day with a video, or every day with just a read aloud. We want to really be able to vary that. And as we're thinking about different learning paths, we want to make sure that we have flexible spaces or grouping or learning options. Again, making that space for multiple modalities in our presentation, or having students show their understanding. We want to allow students to have choice. That does not mean that they have choice day in and day out for every single thing they do, but it does help create agency for students. We want those varied materials for everyone to use, not just some. And we want to provide those authentic learning opportunities. When it comes to student thinking, we have these just sort of questions that you might be able to ask that will elicit thinking for students. So these are just some examples of prompts or questions that you might be able to ask that will help you get to the level of understanding that a student might have in relation to either their reading or their writing. When it comes to reading, writing, speaking, and listening, there are a couple of different things I want to talk about here. This is a resource that we have here, but we want to make sure that we are looking at different ways for students to be able to either use technology or for us to be able to support our students. And some of these things, whether it be a recording of an audio visual or digital tools in general, we might want to be able to incorporate these into our students' everyday understanding and how they're able to use this within the classroom. Again, we want to know our learning targets. This is just an example. So our learning target might be students will write an essay to demonstrate the phases of butterfly metamorphosis. So this might be our target, but what we really want to understand is it that they need to understand the phases of butterfly metamorphosis? Or is it that we want them to write an essay? Sometimes we put things together, and so we need to make it really understandable. And we need to be dialed into what is the exact reason that they are doing this. Is it that we're trying to have them understand and show us the phases of butterfly metamorphosis? Or is it the fact that we want them to really, maybe if they're writing an essay, maybe we can take out the phases of butterfly metamorphosis and give them choice of what they're writing about rather than just a specific topic. So choice increases engagement. We want them to be able to have choice in their writing topics. We want to design tiered tasks so that students can have choice and make sure that they're setting a goal for growth. And we want to make sure that we're having some high tech and low tech choices throughout the year. When it comes to choice and inquiry, we have inquiry-based learning and project-based learning. We're not really getting into that as much, but it's just an example of how you might be able to, incorporate choice into your classroom. And this is sort of our wrap up. This is the sort of epitome of differentiation, right? So we want teachers to not ignore those student differences, right? So this is just basically saying if we ignore their differences, we're not maximizing the potential of our students that aren't necessarily the norm or the middle. So these are just some tech tools to help you be able to to support students and have them access differentiation. So Padlet, student, Google Docs, Google Slides. So there's just some general information here for you. I didn't want to leave before giving you the information. I know that this wasn't necessarily a UDL presentation, but the New Hampshire Department of Education has been working with CAST since 2015 to be able to really help you understand UDL within your particular schools and your classrooms. The Department of Ed is really moving towards taking that on themselves. Lynette Lawrence was hoping to be here today. She's not able to be here, but she wanted to make sure you had her information if you have any just general questions about UDL and anything going forward with that. So I wanted to put that on here. The New Hampshire Department of Ed is going to have an assessment and accountability newsletter. So stay tuned for that. It's coming around January 1st. Here's the information for us. Sorry, we went over by a few minutes today. I know your time is valuable. So we appreciate you coming and have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone.